Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Waffles, I'm talking about the 2003 album from Gridlock, Formless. Gridlock were the American IDM duo of Mike Cadu and Mike Wells. I'd known about these guys for several years, but never got the chance to actually hear their stuff until working on this review. I admittedly haven't heard any of their other albums, or any of their other work, but this album is easily their most well-known project, and widely considered to be an IDM classic. As far as I can tell, these guys actually came from more of like a metal and industrial background before they started up Gridlock in the mid-90s. They put out 4 studio albums in total. I'm told they started out inspired by artists like Skinny Puppy, but got progressively more ambient and IDM-centric, culminating in this album from 2003, released on Hyman Records, which was also their final release before they disbanded for good. Cadu has since remained pretty prolific, putting out lots of solo work under his own name, as well as under the aliases Bitcrush and Drift, D-R-Y-F-T, under which he's released multiple albums as each and still remains active to this day. While Wells started work as a mastering engineer from there on, having a ton of work under his belt for all manner of different artists from lots of different genres, ranging from Tommy Guerrero, Triphonic, Odd Nozdam, or Somatic Responses, to dozens of various rock and metal bands I'd never heard of, like Cobra Skulls, The Blank Tapes, or Howls of Ebb, to even people like Green Day or Rhett and Link, among many others. At least before his unfortunate passing this past January. R.I.P. But anyway, I'd primarily known about Gridlock thanks to this album in particular. I'd seen it show up on like multiple different lists talking about the greatest IDM or even electronic albums of all time, and it had been on my bucket list to check out for ages. But thanks to this request, I finally got the chance to hear it for myself and see whether all the hype was worth it. And, yeah, I can confirm this album is in fact really freaking good, and I definitely see where the hype is coming from. Sonically, this project was really openly striking from any time I'd previewed through it in the past. Its mix of intense, overbearing, banging IDM percussion going up next to warm blends of melodic synth pads always sounded really cool to me right from the jump. Additionally, as I've sat with this album, it has really stuck out to me how seamless the flow on this entire album is. It has one of the smoothest continuous mixes I've heard in a very long time, and every track feels like a direct continuation of the one that came before. It's so well flowing, the whole thing may as well be treated as a single hour-long track. And this fact is both one of the album's greatest strengths as well as its single greatest weakness. I mean, I do in fact think this album does scrape into great territory for me, but not like by a huge margin. I'll admit it has been a bit of a difficult one for me to parse in the past 2 months or so, as I've often put this album on and it would fall into the background almost alarmingly fast. That's not to say that it translates to this album being tedious or anything. Whenever I'd put it on, the hour it lasts would always zip by as if it were nothing, but I would never notice when a single track would begin or end until the closer done processing started. I could glance at my iPod, think I was on track 3, and I was really on track 6. Then the next listen I would look at my iPod thinking I was on track 6, and oh, I'm on track 14. It was as if 2 minutes after I would first hit play on the album, a full hour would immediately disappear from my life without me even noticing. This album runs together like very few other projects I've heard in a very long time, though given that's completely by design, it's difficult to say how much of an active criticism that really is. The album is, after all, called Formless. When I actively sat up and watched the track listing as it was playing out, all the track boundaries did still make perfect sense, and they're never so samey to feel like the tracks don't have identities of their own, but the transitions are so subtle that you do have to actively sit up and look to even hear most of them. I will also have to admit, not every track on this thing hits me as effectively as the next. Moments like the relatively more playful beat skitters and melodies of Distance, the initially more organic but progressively mechanical clanking patterns of Displacement, or the more visceral banging of Re-Module and its especially Audiker Amber-esque melodies. These are all solid tracks that fit into the cohesive sound of the album quite well, but maybe left me wishing they could have done a bit more to set themselves apart. Doubly so with the track Scratch, which kind of generically sounds like every other track on this album without having enough special or unique in its own right. That one track is probably the closest I would say this album has to having skippable filler, although I guess that one does have a somewhat unique 80s-ish texture to its bass lines, and it does sound just as good out of context as anything else here. I still wouldn't skip it. Not that an album structured like this would benefit from having you skip tracks anyway. There's also the 3 untitled interludes on this album, which I have mixed thoughts on. Played out of context, they do have their own unique sounds and feel markedly more abstract and sparse than most of the other tracks, but in context, they are pretty much just intros and outros attached to other tracks, and honestly remind me more of the hidden tracks on the CD version of Monolake's Interstate. The clanking percussion from distance getting a minute to themselves on the first interlude, a space of spooky ambient synth modes and Boards of Canada-ish melodic textures leading into Chrometaphor on the second interlude, a swirl of random experimental synth blurs to cap off Remodule on the third interlude. These cuts technically make sense being separated out, especially the second one. That one stands on its own the best. But they would make just as much sense being lumped in as part of their surrounding tracks. You could sell a digital version of this album separated into 12 tracks, like how the digital versions of Interstate have 8 tracks, and you wouldn't technically be lying. But beyond relatively minor quibbles like this, I really don't have much to complain about any of the remaining tracks. All the beats and percussion on this album go really hard and feel really visceral and tactile despite how abrasive they can be, and they go up next to lots of surprisingly warm and inviting ambient melodic textures, and they always work together really well. Opener Pallid really starts us off with a bang in its mix of melancholy and intimate pads that go up next to all this crashing and screeching glitched up industrial percussion. It feels like having a nice warm cup of coffee while sitting in the middle of your house being demolished. It's such an attention-grabbing start and pulls you into the sound and vibe of the album immediately. And my favorite stretch of the album is right near the beginning as well. The 3-track run of Return, Song 23, and Invert is nothing short of stunning. Return is probably my favorite track on the album overall, and the various abrasive clanks and crashes going over distant pads starting out fairly abstract and slowly taking more form and structure as they go along, and culminating in this absolutely beautiful moment at the end, aided by guest background vocals from Linda Mandolin, just leaves me without words. Song 23 takes a markedly darker tone with all its abrasive beats going up next to menacing bass pads and chilling, airy melodies. Definitely one of the most sinister sounding cuts on here. And that track's ideas are directly developed and built upon by Invert, which starts out in nothing but wiry ambience, but slowly builds up a markedly slower and more stomping set of percussion patterns. That oddly ends up adding to a mix which feels more tranquil than many of the surrounding tracks. And oh my god, when the second half kicks in and brings in this extra breakbeat to complement the rest of the percussion, it totally transforms the track into something that feels almost trip-hop-ish, and it is so freaking good. Chrometaphor is a really cool track that has a fair bit more progression than many other tracks here, starting out with like a full minute of very minimalistic ambient bass washes, and very slowly building onto itself with more and more varied percussion taps until paying off into all these other super distorted kicks and bass stabs come in and smash you in the face, but also letting the mix die down a bit in the last minute for another more tranquil moment at the end. The Eighth Winter is a standout among a stretch of the album that didn't stick out to me as much, with some much brighter and more uplifting melodies shining through the cracks between its clattering beats, and eventually intensify to feel like this intense, near-blinding source of light is coming from within the center of the track and enveloped everything in its wake. Penultimate cut, Atomontage, has beats that build up and down quite nicely, but has a real sense of bittersweet finality to the tones of its melodies. And there's more female guest vocals to add to this one as well, which are so far in the background you might not even notice they're there at all, but they do still well to add that extra sense of warmth at the end of the album. And that finally takes us to the closer, Done Processing, the only track on the album I would be able to notice the presence of on all my listens, since it's a near 10-minute straight ambient piece. Sometimes closing an album like this can lead to a cut that feels maybe a little directionless or anticlimax on its own. See M83 Saturdays equals Youth. But this cut does have a minimal amount of progression in its sets of slowly shifting paths that can alternatively feel dark and moody or bright and hopeful. And it does have the right sense of emotional satisfaction to really feel like the proper ending to the entire project and not just like a tacked on epilogue or credit roll. Honestly hits a similar note for me as something like Aphex Twin's Stone and Focus. Sounds a fair bit like that particular track too, if maybe with a tiny bit more epic sounding and cleaner production and a bit less meditative in its approach, but still that comparison is only a compliment. But that's everything on Formless. I mean, I'm not going to tell you I think this is one of my new favorites of all time or anything. It was definitely not an immediate listen, and I'll admit that did throw me off since I went in really wanting it to be. I had pretty high expectations going into this album for the first time because I knew how many people held it up as an all-time classic, and the bits that I had heard sounded really bright and striking and like they'd be right up my alley, and they were. But it did feel worrying for me for my first 4 listens of the album to pass in one ear and out the other, and for me to only be able to distinguish the sound of one track out of 15. But that did wear off as I gave it more active listens and really sat with it more to pick apart the finer details for this video. And it slowly started to reach the level I initially hoped it'd get to. And even if I still think it is maybe a bit too samey for me to quite hold up next to my true all-time favorites, I do in fact think this album is properly great. I can pretty much confirm its classic status as much as everyone else has. You should definitely check it out. Once again, RIP Mike Wells. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.